Welcome back to the channel. So you're here with Nate28, or otherwise known as Crossbeats Production. The reason for this video is I just wanted to do a video on how I go about mastering a track, and also I guess the pre-work before that before that actually happens. So the things that I do in preparation to the mastering of my own tracks and how I go about it. So the key thing that I found when mastering a track, now I want to do a bit of talking about how I go about it, and also I just want to do a explanation and show you actually how I do it. So the preparation to mastering a track, there's many different things that you want to do in your mix before you even master your track. The basics to that though are just compression, EQ, and reverb and things like that. Now with this track, it's not a complete track. I've just actually made this track just for this sake of showing everybody how I go about mastering a track. Now this track is in the process of being made. It's not a complete track, so just bear that in mind. This is just purely so you can see how I go about mastering my tracks, or making them loud enough that you can play them anywhere and they'll sort of compete with what's out there on the radio and whatnot. So I do a lot of music for a Christian label, and I'm not going to mention that label at the moment because there's things that I'm trying to work out with them at the moment and how I want to go about with my deal. But nonetheless, this video I'll just explain how I go about stuff. So basically, to start with, what I would do when I mix my track, so this is not about mixing, but I just want to give you the idea of how I go about the beginning to the mastering of that. So I would normally put a compressor on the track. You can go about this in a couple of different ways, and there's probably a number of different ways that you can approach it on every different song, but generally I try and have a mastering compressor, or a bus compressor I should say, on my stereo out channel, so my main channel out. This may not even actually be doing a whole lot, and you'll see what I'm talking about in a minute, but the basis of this is just to give you the sound that you're starting off with, so you're not later on surprised by the sound that you get by adding a compressor later on. There are compressors within Logic, and I'm going to show you how to use those, because I don't think that everybody has to have plugins, and I don't think plugins are the end all of every single mix, because you can do everything you want with stock plugins. Guaranteed you can make your track sound fantastic with just stock plugins. And the reason why I bought this compressor at the start was because I thought otherwise, but over time I've discovered that yeah, there are fantastic things about plugins, and yes, they do emulate certain things and characteristics and stuff like that, but they're nowhere near exactly the same way as hardware do, but they're close, and that's, I guess, the key to why people make these plugins. So anyway, this isn't about whether or not plugins are good. So the main thing I'll do, basically have this as a compressor on the main bus, and I'll show you how I would do it if I was going to use a stock plugin. So I'd just use the compressor within Logic, and if you're aware of these compressors here, the standard compressors, by the way, this is Logic, the new update. You can expand this so it looks bigger, which is pretty cool. So what I would do, I'd throw your compressor on there at the end of your mix, well, at the start of your mix, but at the end of the final stereo out track. So get that on there and just have a fiddle around with your threshold, your ratio. The keys to mastering a track is very little achieves very lot. That's pretty much the principle that I've gone from for a long time, and every mastering engineer I've ever seen or researched or heard of, it's always minimalistic stuff. They're not there to go and destroy the track. They're not really even there to make it sound like they're even there. That's the key of mastering a track, pretty much, is to make it sound as clean, clear, loud, if you want it loud, or dynamic, either way. That's the key to having a well mastered track, and that's pretty much it. It just comes down to making your track the best it can be, and without altering it too much or changing it to the original state, unless it's obviously required to. I'm sorry about the crickets in the background. So anyway, this is the compressor. So I'll just play this track and I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'll let you have a listen to what it sounds like with the compressor on, so you can get an understanding of what I'm talking about. Okay, let me stop it right there. Now, as you could see, I was just flicking through all of the compressors that this main stock compressor has to offer. I actually didn't go through all of them, but you can see each one has its own different sound. Even if you look at the attack on these compressors, sorry, where the threshold and the knee actually hits, sorry, not the attack. So the knee is this little thing here. So that's basically where the knee. So if you look at this threshold, pretty much I'll play the track and you can see how it's being affected. Okay, so pretty much each compressor has a different knee, and that in essence affects the way that the compression works and also the way the sound is affected. The transient is affected mostly because of that, and that's what I guess is key and crucial to when you're listening for things. It takes time for your ear to be trained on certain things like that, but the main thing is just to listen to things that, like for example, the kick, the snare, anything that's got a heavy transient hit. Listen for those things, because those are going to be telling you how your track in the end is going to sound when it's fully mastered. So the key to this, why I put this compressor on here in the first place, was just to bring all the sounds cohesively together. I normally wouldn't master my tracks like this, in the fact that I would have bounced this file out once I'm satisfied with how it sounded. I would have bounced that file out completely, so I wouldn't have had all these tracks out like this, because pretty much you're creating a CPU load that unnecessarily you don't need when you want to do mastering. But nonetheless, I just wanted to show you the actual file, just so you could see I did this from scratch. I didn't go around just getting somebody else's track and making it. So pretty much, it's a pretty good sub. Pretty much that's what I would do. First off, I'd throw a compressor on there if I was going to master the track, and then I'd actually get another compressor and I'd also do similar kind of things. So my philosophy, and I'm sure 1,000 other people probably would agree, maybe other people don't, but I like to share the load over not just one compressor, but two, maybe even three. And the reason for this is because you don't have to actually drive your compressor so hard just to get the sound that you're desiring. And especially when you have heavy bass or low end in your song, you don't want just one compressor handling that and then the other part of it. Like basically the low end's going to affect your compressor more than the top end, unless the top end is really loud, which generally it's not. And pretty much when I listen for things, especially when I watch for the needle. I'll just move this down so you can see how it works. And the exact same thing applies when you put a limiter on it as well. I tend to use 2 limiters rather than 1, just because I can control the ceiling a lot more, and I don't have to put my limiter, the first one, under so much pressure to take care of every single part of this musical track. So I'd prefer to share the load between the two. And honestly, I've discovered that this is like, I don't know, it's like the holy grail of things. And I'm pretty sure I've heard a lot of different unspoken things where people have used double the limiter or 2 limiters to try and, first give the transients a taming, and then they use that other part of the limiter, the next limiter, to then raise that volume just right as closest to the ceiling as possible, to make it as loud as they desire it to be. But if you do it that way, it kind of gives the track more of a transient feel and just a fatter feel, and less distortion, because it's not reaching, the ceiling, and it's not crushing the mix completely. So anyway, let's get to this. So I'll just show you how I would then put this compressor on here. For the sake of things, I'm just going to use another stock compressor, because I just want to show you that it's possible with these Logic compressors. So I'll just move that out of the way, and let's just do this again. Now for this first compressor, I'll just make this a lot smaller so you can see that it's still functioning, and it's definitely there. Now this one, let's do the same thing. Let's make it a bit smaller so I can fit them both on the screen. Alright, so first compressor, right? Number 1. Let's just fast forward the track a bit. See, just there, when I pulled that threshold just a little bit more down, it's like every single thing in the track just came together. Now, that's the kind of thing that you're listening for, especially when you're doing the mix originally. If you can get that achieved in your mix before you even do the master. I mean, some people, if you're mastering their tracks, you might not have the opportunity because you didn't mix their tracks, so it might come to you this way. But the key to getting your first mix is getting everything to sound extremely cohesive and all together, and everything not overly compressed, but just so it sounds all glued together. That's the word that they use. So that's exactly what I just felt like I achieved then. So as you can see, both compressors are working, but they're not working too hard. They're both working together and in unison. And the other thing I want to point out as well is that, when you watch these needles, watch them and also listen to the tempo and listen to the track and listen to the kick, and watch how the needle responds with the kick and things like that. And it's kind of almost in the same time as the track. And that's another little cheat or I guess, like a code that you could use. It's so simple. You just watch the needle and you just watch the kick and watch the track and the tempo, and you see that once they line up together, that's when it sounds really, really good. Now just watch this. I'll show you what I'm talking about. See that? That's what I'm talking about, where the kick, it makes the needle respond similar to the way the kick is going. So you should be able to see that needle and feel the same rhythm in the track, and it kind of, once it's like that, you know that the track's going to be really well put together and it's fitting together and it's cohesive. So if you had that going on just like that on your own track, then you know that it's going to be exactly how it should sound and pretty much ready for mastering from this point. So that's the pre-process to the mastering. Okay, so let's just say we're at -11. I'm leaving enough headroom, by the way, so it's about -11 or -10 or wherever, somewhere near that area. I mean, you could go up to -6, you can go to -3. There's no real rule on how loud you can do it pre-mastering, apart from the fact if you've already reached peak ceiling and it's over the ceiling, it's just pretty much destroyed, and there's no point trying to master it from that point because you can't make it sound any better than it, I guess it would have been at the start before you smashed the whole thing through the ceiling. But anyway, so that's the two stock compressors basically. This one, as you can see, I'll just make it bigger again. So the settings, you can see pretty much I left this on -12 because that's an auto gain, but it actually sets it so it's -1 right now, but then it's auto gain, so it doesn't go too much louder than originally before I put the compressor on. So I'm trying to achieve compression without adding volume. That's the key to also making it sound clear, because a lot of people think, oh yeah, it sounds better when it's loud, but really you haven't changed anything when it's louder. You're just making it deceive you pretty much. So that's that compressor. I've got this other compressor on, and this is auto gain off altogether. So this is at -1. So I actually think I've decreased the volume of the actual full track. So let me just play it before and after with the compressors. Now pay attention to the kick. Listen to the kick. So the kick sounds like it's more flabby and it's not really together. And you add the compressor in, listen to this. Okay, now it sounds pretty clear, pretty good. So the next step, basically, sorry this is such a long video, and I just really want to explain it properly so you understood how this all works. So other people, they like to use the mix button on this function just so they can get a mix of the actual compressed and non-compressed. I think for the minute when you're first starting out, I would assume that you probably don't understand a whole lot of this stuff. So if I was you and I was just starting out, like when I first started out on this, I didn't use any of the mix stuff because I had no idea how it really worked. And all it pretty much is you're basically mixing your original mix with the new mix, sorry. So your original mix is this side, so the input, output. So you're mixing between the old and the new pretty much. So the compressed and the non-compressed, that's all it is basically. But pretty much I would just stick to 100% mix if you don't understand the concept of the ratios and makeup gain and threshold and all that sort of stuff. So I mean, I didn't use it on that track and it doesn't need it at this point, and this is just an example on how I do a quick master. So okay, so we've got that, that's all good. All right, next step. So what do we want to get this loud and clear and cohesive? So the next step I would normally do is EQ. Now people either like to do EQ prior compression, or they like to do it after, or they can do it in between. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer to this, and to be honest, I think in my experience, I like to do EQ after compression on mastering side of things. It all depends. Sometimes it sounds good before because a certain frequency is not affecting the compressor as much because it's been lowered down with the EQ if you're reducing frequencies with the EQ. The other thing is, I guess, people will use EQ to boost. I tend to not use EQ too much to boost unless it's extremely necessary, where I want to get a sound a bit louder or a certain part of that sound louder. Especially with drums. Before I get to the mastering part of that, I just want to show you a lot of my drums. I've reduced out certain parts of this, and I'll do another tutorial if people want to see mixing, but pretty much, you know, I've EQ'd a lot of stuff out of the drums, and there's a good reason why I did that, because I don't want the high frequencies stealing other parts of the instruments. For example, piano, I want that to really be clear, sticking out, and with the mix, I don't want other things stealing that. So let's just put this EQ on here and I'll show you what I've done here. So this is the mastering EQ within Logic, and it's pretty much, it's not a mastering EQ per se, it's an EQ for any application, but it's a linear phase EQ, and preferably people like to use linear phase because they don't create phase issues. They do have other problems that they create, but generally linear phase are the ones that they use on the mastering bus. So I'll play without EQ, and then I'll add the EQ, and I'll show you why and what I've done. Okay, so EQ. The main things to look out for, if you're not doing a whole lot in the mix, then it's going to be difficult. But the main things I look out for when I do an EQ on mastering is removing some of the low end frequency that's not necessary, especially when it comes to the limiter, because the limiter is going to be affected by that the most. And also, so likewise with compression, the compressor will also have the same effect if you leave low end in there. But for this sake, I'm just showing you the fact that I removed low end out at about 29.5 hertz, because that from that point down, it's pretty much not hearable to the human ear. You can hear it; it's very low frequencies, but it's not necessary, especially when you want to clean up your mix and you want it to sound full loud and as loud as possible without it affecting the limiter too much. And the same with the top end. I've kind of removed out till about 15,800, and that kind of it made the mix a bit more dull. And at the end, if you wanted to add another EQ to increase, other frequencies, that's when you would do it. On this particular one, I'm not going to do it for the sake of time, but normally I'd have two EQs. If I'm going to do something, I'd first reduce, and then I'd get a second EQ, and then I would get that in there, and I'd start adding frequencies if I really felt like I needed it. But mainly on mastering, you're there to try and remove the things that don't sound good, and if necessary, then add things that do. But if there's things that you really want it to sound good, you'd want to do that in the mix before you get to the mastering phase. So always I just go by twos of everything pretty much, because that's the key to it. I honestly think they partner with each other, and they make a really good mix if you do two of everything. So two compressors, two EQs if you want. You don't have to, but it's just my advice on this, and that's what I do. The other thing is I always mix in mono, so that's one key to getting a good mix. That was just on there for that reason. Now, a limiter. So what are we trying to achieve with a limiter? There's many different limiters on the market, isotope, waves, all sorts of ones that they make, and they're all good in their own way or another. I do have isotope ozone, and I can make another video specializing on just that, but for this video I want to use stock plugins. Like I said, I just wanted to get this all done on stock plugins so it can be shown as done and people can understand that you don't have to have plugins that are external third-party plugins. So what have I done with this one? I reduced the ceiling down to minus 0.5, and that's prior that, you know, the ceiling is pretty much 0 is clipping, or above I should say is clipping. That you don't want to clip, you want to have it about 0.5, just that way that, you know, you've got a bit of clearance, especially if you're going to put your track on a CD or MP3. You know, the compression, it does add a little bit of noise, and it most certainly could get you over that level of clipping, you know, quite easily without you even knowing it once it's bounced to track or MP3 or, you know, encoded in another format. So I just try and keep it minus 0.5. People say industry standard is 0.03. I just like to keep it at 5 just because to me it sounds better. It's not distorting like it does closer to the ceiling. So I've added gain. There's quite a bit of gain there actually, and the reason why I could do that is because, you know, you can see here I've got this at minus 11, and that's given me a lot of headroom to get this then louder at the end when I want to master the track. So the key to mastering a track, first mix, it doesn't have to be loud. You can get it just so it's very dynamic if you want it to be that way. This track's not a whole lot dynamic, but anyway, so turn that on and I'll turn it off and I'll show you what it sounds like. Okay, let's just do this and I'll show you the difference. By the way, sorry about that. You might want to turn down your monitors if they're up loud, because I don't want to cause any damage to them. So let's start again. Okay, so what do we got going on here? The update for Logic Pro X, the most recent update, gave us a few features, and especially the change of look to this limiter. Now this limiter is a maximizer limiter, so it actually adds volume to the, you can maximize it as much as you want pretty much. Now the things that I would do, which are in some of the third-party plugins, especially isotope ozone 6 or 5 or 7 or whatever, which one you've got now. So 7 is the most recent one. So this thing called DC offset. So DC offset basically allows you to have a little bit more headroom by correcting the DC, the DC offsets. So it removes DC offset, which, if you've ever seen it before, on a fully mastered track, all the waveforms would be bending down, they're not even. With DC offset, you'd want to make sure that either you've got no issue with DC offset, and there's a way with ozone at least that you can see whether or not it has. And I'll just quickly show you. Where is the ozone? Alright, let's just use 5 because that's the most probably used one at this point. A lot of people still have it. So DC offset, actually, yeah, you can see it. So this little thing here, that'll show you in red if there is a requirement for DC correction. So I'll just quickly play it and I'll just show you. I don't think this track needs it, but maybe it does. Okay, so as you can see just here, I'll reset it again. DC offset is required, so if you just turn that on, that would give that correction of DC offset and it wouldn't affect the track anymore. It just clears up a bit of headroom pretty much from what I'm aware. It's not a massive thing, but yeah, anyway, that's that. So you can put the DC offset on if it sounds better with it, sounds better without it, to your discretion. So true peak limiter detection, all this is it's detecting your transients before they actually hit the limiter, and it allows your limiter to, I guess, see what's happening in the future before it's actually limiting the track, so that way it can prepare and the limiter can react accordingly to that. So that's what that does. And the optimal lock head, so that's the lock on the actual limiter, the head sealing, and that's how fast it reacts. So that's that. I increased the gain, so I had approximately gain reduction. I'll just show you. Maybe I'll just turn this down so it's at -12 so it doesn't blast everyone else. So let's skip past to this and we'll turn it up. Let's get to some transient stuff. Okay, so basically I've got a -0.3 reduction. Now that's very minimal, and that's done on purpose for a reason, because I don't want it to distort when it hits the other limiter. So let me just show you what I'm doing. Now that's not loud because I just turned it down at the stereo output. So I've got the second limiter on here, right? And this is for a reason, because I'm only increasing by a little bit, and the release on this is quite fast. It's at 3.2 milliseconds. Now the output ceiling I've created at -0.1. I might just put that to -1, and lock head at 1.1 milliseconds. Now I don't need to have this true peak detection on again because I've already got it on this one, and that's already adequate enough and it's doing its job. So just watch how much reduction I get on this second limiter, and you'll see why I use these two and how clear it makes it sound with both of them working together. Now just listen to the track. So pretty much I'm getting -2, and if you compound the first limiter up here and you compound that, just add these two figures together. Now you probably wouldn't even want to get anything more than -4, -5, -6 maximum. Otherwise it really starts to crush your drum. Now I'll show you what I'm talking about when I say crush the drum, because when I crank this up it's going to sound very crushed. Okay, so that's -3.7 and then 3, -0.03 or 0.3, sorry. So those two figures together, you just add those up, and approximately -4 dB is as much as you'd probably want to get without completely crushing it. Now it's at -1, and the headroom up here, if I was to turn this all the way up, which I will do later on just to show you, but you should turn your volume down on your monitors when I do, so I'll show you that. So basically I'll just put this at 0, and right now it was at -14 because that's where it was set and I pulled it down to that point. Turn your monitors down, and I'm going to crank this track and I'll show you how good it sounds, and it's loud and it's clear and it's radio ready and it's not distorted. So let's just play this right now. Let's just go through it. Turn your monitors down right now. Yeah, Welcome to the mastering tutorial. Yeah, when you wanna see your back down, cause I had to do a rap there. Anyway, so that is how I master a track. Now it's so simple, and there are other things that you may want to do when you're mastering tracks, especially when it comes down to monitoring your track, the loudness level and metering. I would always recommend having something like this. Actually, I haven't seen this since I updated it. Now a correlation meter just tells you whether or not your track's in phase, and that's a huge thing to know, especially when you have things out of phase. It doesn't sound right, and also it affects your low end a very, very huge amount. Let me see what other metering they've got in here as a stock plugin. So level metering, what's this look like? Man, this looks pretty cool. I haven't seen it since I updated it. I actually haven't used it. I probably should. Now I'll show you what I'm talking about and why you should use these metering things. Let me just get the other thing. I'm pretty sure correlation meter. Okay, so I've already got that. Let's close that. Here's the other thing. Level multimeter. There we go, that's the one we're after. Ah, sick, man, that looks pretty cool. Okay, so the things you want to look for. Let me close these limiters down. Let me turn this down so it doesn't blast your ears out. And I'll show you what I'm doing with these things. So the reason why, they're pretty much the same kind of thing, but what you're looking for is RMS. Do peak and RMS, or you can do true peak or true peak and RMS. Now RMS is pretty much the indicator as to how loud your track is at a consistent value, and peak is where the peak transient hits and then it comes back down to the RMS level. So there's a whole lot of math behind it, but basically the thing you want to look for is, one, the peak obviously is where your limiter is allowing your track to go. So the peak on mine was at -1, and the things that I wanted to look for is how loud the RMS was and also where my peak hit. So I'll show you how loud this goes, right? So you're not going to see at this point, because I've turned it down, it's at -12, right? But my peak is at -1 because that's where my limiter was set to. So correlation meter is this thing here, and it's also on this screen here, and it shows you the correlation. And basically the thing you want to look for is to always stay in the green area. Is handy. It's very you know, there's no phase issues when it's in the green. If it starts to go below this line here, that's when you're beginning to get phase issues, and especially on a full mix, when you're putting things together, you will get phase issues. The way that I find to eliminate a lot of the phase issues from the get-go is to have tracks like, for example, your drums. Some things bounce out of other programs in stereo. I try to make those things in mono. This is another mixing thing, which I'll get into in another tutorial. But try to keep things, especially like those things that are already existing in mono in the real world, keep them in mono and then add reverb to them to make them louder, or add chorus effect or whatever you need to do to make them sound wider. But just always watch your correlation meter, because that'll tell you whether or not you're going to have phase issues later on, or even whilst you're doing it. You can generally hear things that are phasey or have phase issues. I can, at least anyway now, because I've been doing this for a while, but maybe at the start you might not be able to hear it. But when things that have phase issues and they're affecting other things, you can hear them. They can't cancel out each other, and the sounds a bit weird too, like distorted or kind of funny. So that's the correlation meter. The true peak meter here, as I was showing you the level meter, that's also on this thing here, and it does show you a couple of different new features on here. Oh, that's crazy. Okay, you can change it on. It doesn't. Oh, it's not the same, right? So this is basically that's this thing up here, and that's this thing here. So if you just opened up the analyzer, you could do all of it in one window. But I just like to have a lot of stuff that I can view at once, so I can see exactly the same thing, just to make sure. Now, this analyzer here, I'll show you exactly what, sorry, this thing here, I'll show you what this is doing. So this also shows you phase and your stereo field, and it shows you the mono and your left and right channels. And it will show you if things are out, and especially if you've got phase issues. So let me just play this track to you. And it's pretty cool looking as well, because it's kind of fun to watch, and you can definitely see when you have phase issues. Let me just make it a bit bigger. This is sick. I like Logic. So as we're watching now, you're seeing your peak levels here, you're seeing another metering level here, and the correlation meter, and the peak and the hold reset button, and decay, auto gain, all that stuff. So this will show you the analyzer of your EQ. So it shows you where your frequencies are. 0, I don't know why it's 0.5, I guess because, oh, okay. So they've set this at +5 because of the headroom thing, and the range at 60 dB, which is the range of your headroom within your DAW. It's pretty technical. I don't want to get into that in this video, but basically all that is a metering thing, so you can see where your limit is. Now the EQ thing here, you're just watching to see all the frequencies are kind of level. Not 100% level, because the low end frequencies are always going to be louder usually, and these are going to be lighter in sound and less volume. So that's what I look for when I do that. I don't really have to rely too much on this, because I can just hear it by ear. But if you're going to rely on it, you can just see that the top end frequencies at 16K are cut out because of the EQ that I took earlier on, sorry. Where is it? See, I took those out at 16, and other ways I've EQ'd it prior to this mastering. Now, low end frequencies, you don't want them to steal too much, and I think the top at the range they get to -10, and that's because of the way I've held this down. But if I increase the volume, okay, so pretty much that's what I look for when I master a track. It's not that difficult really, to be honest. It's very simple, but it does take time, and it does definitely take an ear over time to understand what you're listening for. But don't shy away from it, because you know, if you're starting to learn this stuff, trust me, it does take time, and you can make plenty of mistakes when you're doing it. And I've made so many mistakes in my mixing career, and especially in my production career, just learning things and making mistakes. It's the best way. I mean, honestly, if you're keen on doing it and you really want to understand the concept of mixing, go watch as many YouTube tutorials as you can. You know, watch some of my tutorials, subscribe to my channel, and all that sort of stuff. But honestly, it's so much fun once you understand the basics and the concepts of these things. It just makes it so much more enjoyable. At the start, when you don't understand it, it's just like anything else. It's hard to get used to, especially like riding a bicycle or whatever. You get on it, you fall off, blah blah blah, but eventually you get on it, you ride like a pro. And that's what, you know, what us audio people aim for. We try to get better and better and better and better, and that's just the key to it. I mean, honestly, it's not rocket science. People make it out like it is. You just have to understand certain things, and understand that you can learn all of it in time. It's definitely something you can learn, and it's never too late to start. And I encourage everybody that's already in this field, that are trying to do it, keep going and pressing forward, because great things can happen from you just having patience, training yourself, and understanding that patience really is the key to it. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If there's any other tutorials you want me to do, or anything in the comments you want to hit me up with, let me know. And please remember to like and subscribe, because it does help my channel out a lot. And I'd like to say peace and thanks a lot. Yeah.